Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're discussing the failure of the EU summit on migration and how this exposes Italy's outstanding challenges in Europe. Brunello, an EU Council meeting was held last week. There were several things on the agenda, but let's just take a bird's eye view. Could you summarize some of those key points?
Yeah, there were several items on the agenda. The first one was, of course, developments in Ukraine after the failed or near coup, call it as you want, in Russia um, uh, from the Wagner brigade that ended up the way we know, with Prigozhin going to Belarus and then sort of black hole in what has actually happened and what will actually happen to Wagner in the future. Um, Clearly, the EU partners reinforced their support to Ukraine um, and actually managed to further increase the financial ceiling of the European Peace Facility. So that was point one on the agenda. Point two was a strategic discussion on China and how to approach China in the situation in which it seems increasingly clear that there's a polarization of the world. Of course, they say that they want to have a constructive and stable relationship with China, but they've also said that they want to de-risk, meaning they want to diversify the supply chains that start with China. The third point on the agenda was the migration policy of the EU. In theory, it should have been non-controversial because there has been uh, recently a meeting of the Justice and Home Affairs Council that has released some important new pieces of legislation regarding migration and asylum policy. But guess what? Um, both Morawiecki and Orban, the leaders of Poland and Hungary, respectively, vetoed the conclusions because of the council because they thought that the results of these uh, Justice and Home Council meeting were not satisfying. And that has clearly upset all other leaders, but there's very little they can do about that.
All right. Let's expand on that third point a little bit more because the EU has this legal regime called the Asylum Procedures Regulation, the APR, but it's creating some friction, as you mentioned, with Poland and Hungary. Could you tell us a bit more about the APR and what the EU is doing to sort of tackle this friction?
Yeah, so the asylum procedure regulation establishes a sort of common procedure across the EU member states, and all states needs to follow that procedure for migrants seeking international protection. There's the APR, and then there's the so-called AMR, so the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation, which is a sort of new Dublin agreement. It replaces the old Dublin agreement, which was totally unsatisfactory because,
Hmm.
let's remember, effectively said that countries have the right to report, deport somebody, would say, bring back migrants found anywhere else in the Union in the countries of first arrival, which of course put enormous pressures on countries of first arrival, such as Italy and Greece, but also provided them an incentive not to register those migrants so that they could somehow freely go to Germany, France, Scandinavia, even the UK. So the idea was, I haven't seen you, you're not, we're not the country of first arrival. Whoever sees you first, that's the country of first arrival. So clearly it was totally, how can I say, unsatisfactory. So the new um, Asylum and Migration Management Regulation says that instead, migration and asylum procedure are EU policies. They cannot be left with individual countries because that would put an enormous burden on especially Italy and Greece. To some extent, we saw it with Poland that had to get lots of migrants and refugees from Ukraine. So actually, this is a problem that now is affecting everybody from wherever, every country from wherever those migrants are coming. But then these two new pieces of legislation effectively establish a sort of, I would say, solidarity that needs to happen within the EU on those issues. No country is left alone anymore. And think about that Hungary and Poland were effectively countries that were saying, in particularly Hungary, was saying, how many migrants are you willing to accept? And his number was zero. I'm not going to accept any single migrant in my own territory. So coming from that to, okay, now you have to show solidarity, it wasn't kind of the way that Orban wanted to proceed and to some extent Morawiecki. So both of them vetoed the conclusions, and there was a statement by Charles Michel, the president of the EU Council, concluding the communique says that the president kind of realizes this is the position of Hungary and Poland, and then in the context of the ongoing work on the Pact of Migration and Asylum, there is a need to find a consensus on an effective migration and asylum policy, and the EU will continue to work towards this goal. So, hands up for the time being, veto on these conclusions. Meloni tried the last minute negotiation, an agreement with these two leaders that apparently that, as we know historically, belonged to her own camp. So sort of sovereignist or right-wing positions, but even Meloni failed.
Right. And that leads me really well to my next question, because Meloni, obviously, her dream is to bring the European group that she leads, the European conservatives and reformists, into power ahead of the next year's election in Europe. What specific kind of implications does this have for Meloni at home in Italy, but also for her visions for Europe?
So the key point is that Meloni has been trying to forge a sort of alliance with the EPP, Manfred Weber as the leader, and Meloni have met several times. Somehow they want to add the ECR, the European Conservative and Reformists, to the majority that will elect the next president of the Commission. So to counterbalance the presence of the Greens, for example, in the majority, or the Liberals in the majority, so or a la Macron. So in order to bring or shift the axis more towards the center, potentially even center-right. But this episode shows how difficult this political operation is, because you still have to deal with characters such as Orban and Morawiecki, who are not easily brought back into the sort of governing majority. So this is the first real challenge that Meloni has faced in Europe, at the time in which she's already facing another important challenge. She says she doesn't want Italy to ratify the treaty to reform the ESM, European Stability Mechanism. Why? Because Meloni thinks that this should only be ratified when the new rules for the Stability and Growth Pact will be established in a sort of package deal. But again, this is not how things work in Europe. It's like wanting to assert a position is very difficult to maintain. Italy may be one of the largest beneficiaries of the ESM in case of a banking crisis. Certainly not Germany, the majority shareholder, that can save some banks with its own money. So it's kind of unbelievable for most countries that Italy is trying to establish this link or this trade-off or this trade between ESM and Stability and Growth Pact. They risk losing on both sides, when in fact um, the reform of the Stability Growth Pact is more or less going in the direction that Italy wants, with this one-to-one negotiation between the Commission and the country. And the ESM is just a technical feature. So they are creating a political issue where there shouldn't be one. But that's not the right approach. Now, so far, Meloni has been considered kind of imposter child of, of Italian prime minister so far. Very cautious, extremely moderate, mainstream. She has surprised on the upside and on so many levels. But we have always said that the test will really come when more difficult decisions will need to be made, and it seems like the time has finally come, because these are difficult decisions that needs to be made. More difficult decisions will come in coming months if a recession arrives, and this is when Italy's position and Meloni's ability will put to a test.
Right. I still remember when in the run up to when Meloni was running for election in Italy. I mean, I think the worst fears were that she'd take a very hardline approach. But what we've seen is almost sort of the opposite of that on, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's refugees, whether it's the ESM, she sort of coalesced towards the center, kind of more mainstream and cautious approach than perhaps the rhetoric could have suggested earlier on. But really, when she's pushed on these really crucial issues, that might not serve to be the case. So certainly something we'll continue to watch both for Italian and European politics in the weeks ahead. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.